Chapter 9, in which Oscar manages to recite some poetry while being assaulted by his own clothing. "Is that why you stand before me so closely, Sedovitz?" Oscar asked, "forcing me to accommodate your appallingly fishy breath because only one of your eyes works properly?" Raising his whiskers in question, he inadvertently dislodged his pantaloons, which slipped to cover an eye, rendering him in the same predicament as the accused, which he hoped was seen as unflattering caricature rather than unfortunate punctuation. Sedovitz glared at him, before striding to the window and peering from it. "Who are you?" Oscar scoffed. "Will you be asking me the same question ad nauseum, Sedovitz? I heard you the first time, and the fact that I didn't answer suggests I'm unlikely to oblige, regardless of how often you might ask. Is that not obvious, or are you thick as well as blind?" "I admire, to a degree, your prowess, Cat," Sedovitz said, turning to him with a composure unruffled. "But although you may know my name, it is clear you know nothing of me. Were it otherwise, you would certainly not attempt such foolish banter." "Oh, please! Stop contradicting yourself, you silly animal. Either I am incompetent or I have prowess. I can hardly have both." He smirked from beneath half a pair of pantaloons, unless, of course, you do not know the meaning of either. The smirk was unfortunate, because the pantaloons shifted to cover both eyes. Feeling ridiculous, Oscar hoped the more comical he appeared, the more courageous his retort might seem. But Sedovitz would not be drawn, though he chuckled, as though amused by a kitten trying to be scary. "I shall ask you again," he said, "and if you do not answer, I shall retrieve one, literally, by clinically inverting you." To this, Oscar swallowed. "Who are you?" Sedovitz asked. "I am a poet." "A poet?" Oscar's pantaloon-draped head shifted in nod. "And what possible reason might a poet have for sneaking around deserted industrial ports in the middle of the night, pray?" Oscar shrugged. "Inspiration." Sedovitz fell silent. "It's a certain ambience I seek," Oscar said, "in the deserted abandon of places bereft of day." "Prove it." "I beg your pardon?" "Prove that you are a poet." "Well, how?" "Make up a poem now." About what?" "About me." "You?" "Yes." "Well, I'll need a drink of water first." Sedovitz hesitated, then returned to the table and poured some water from the bottle. When Oscar felt the glass at his mouth, he drank messily. "And I'll need my sight back." Sedovitz lifted the pantaloons from his eyes. "Well?" "Well, these things can't be rushed, you know. I need time for inspiration." Sedovitz smashed the glass onto the floor. "If you are a poet, you will compose a verse about me now." So Oscar began. "There was a young cat named Sedovitz, who was ugly and seething with arrogance. Despite being one-eyed, he was always despised, because he could only converse through his bottom bits." Considering his duress, Oscar thought it rather good, and decided that should he survive this curiosa, he might suggest lecturing on spontaneous poetry composition under pressure of interrogation. Sedovitz's eyes narrowed while he mulled the verse over. "Actually, that's quite good." "Oh, you're an expert, are you?" "I dabble." "Well, that's your lot," Oscar said, waggling his restraints. "Now let me go or I'll get cross." "No, I don't think so. A poet you may be, but I do not know who you are or how much you know of me." "Oh, come now," Oscar said. "Surely that much is obvious. You're Sedovitz Tarpanu. Every animal in Ruen knows of you." "I do not believe you. Were it so, you would demonstrate awe rather than inflammation. What is your name?" "Oscar." "Your full name?" "Oscar Teabag Duvin." "Good," purred Sedovitz. "Now we are getting somewhere, and I shall ask you again, how do you know who I am?" "Look," said Oscar, his patience wearing thin, unlike his restraints. "I've already told you, but if that's unacceptable, then I shall lie until we come across an explanation you find more fitting." "I believe you are lying now." Well, I believe in natural yogurt, but it's not going to make a great deal of difference to anything, is it? Fine, then you shall stay here until I deem otherwise. Fine, fine. Realizing the time, Sedovitz cursed and made to leave. Where are you going? Oscar asked. Aren't you going to torture me at all? Sedovitz turned and stared. Torture? He said. What do you think I am, some sort of animal? Why on earth would I want to torture you? Oscar shrugged. I don't know, to get to the truth? I thought you just told me the truth. I did. So why would I need to torture you? Well, you said you didn't believe me. I don't. Oscar was confused. I'd just assumed that's why I was trussed up like this. Do you want to be tortured? No, of course not. Well, then just shut up about it, will you? How can you tell me to shut up when you've just spent the morning demanding I do quite the opposite? What is wrong with you? Sedovitz growled. Why are you trying to rile me so? Ever since you've come round, you've been having a go at me. Oscar laughed. Me? Rile you? I'm the one trussed up like a turkey. You're the one who's supposed to be in control and all smug and great. Well, I'm clearly better than you at the moment. Oh, you think so, do you? Oscar swore, itching to lay one on the animal. Come over here and say that. I'd like to see you being all toffee-nosed when my paws are free. Yeah? Well, I'd rather have a toffee nose than a lack of ears. To this, Oscar wrestled his chair so aggressively that it toppled over, rendering him in a position that afforded no further comment credible. Oh dear, smirked Sedovitz, while donning a pair of leather driving gloves. Clearly I shall have to add clumsy to your list of inadequacies, though I haven't the time to do so, as it would be such a dreadfully long list. I am very busy today, with more on my paws than you could possibly imagine. Oscar growled in a muffled sort of way. I have solid work ahead of me, Sedovitz said, and simply don't have time to go around doing bits of torture for those disturbed enough to desire it. Oscar blinked up at him from his position on the floor, implying such a move had been intentional, but looking about as awkward as an animal can when trussed to a collapsed chair. If you are who you say you are, Sedovitz continued wearily, then fine, whatever. And if you are not, then whatever as well, because I am no longer interested. You shall stay here for the next 2 days. No one knows you are here, and no one need ever see you leave. He turned and strode across the floor. You can't just leave me here. I jolly well can. But what about water and food? Sedovitz pointed at the bottle on the table. Drink that. Well, how on earth am I supposed to manage? Oscar cried, waggling his restrained paws. I have no idea. If it's all too hard, then I suggest you write a poem about it instead. And with that, he strode magnificently across the room and through a door which was then closed with a clack of lock and slide of bolt. In a corridor, the Derby placed an ear against its doors and listened. From one arose a scrabbling and annoyed sort of noise. Using her dividing compass, she picked its lock, slid a bolt, lifted its latch and peered within. The room was huge and had a long window spanning one wall. Although sparsely furnished, it did contain a small, struggling cat, intent on giving a lift to a chair. In a veritable swathe of expletives, the Derby limped toward him. Exhausted, Oscar peered at her for a moment before surrendering to the floor. She skittled to his side, ridding him of binding and attached furniture. When free, he indicated the bottle he'd been grappling toward. Her squall of commentary unabated, she brought it to him, sweeping glass from where he lay and raising his head so he could drink. After the night he'd had, Oscar found her spittle akin to a freshness of summer rain. You seem to have rather a habit of this, she said at her squall's conclusion. Of what exactly? Falling off chairs. But he was too tired to defend himself. Once she'd helped him upright, Oscar looked around, wondering where he was, and asked how she'd found him. The Derby shrugged. You said I was to come and get you. Yes, but how did you know where I was? She retrieved his pantaloons, which had detached themselves during his scrabbling. I followed you with the telescope, she said, offering them. But I lost you behind some buildings. When a car then left quite dramatically, I assumed you'd been stolen." She brushed the remaining glass away and checked him carefully, discovering a nasty bump on his head that had him wincing. "What made you think I'd been stolen?" he asked. "How did you know I hadn't taken the car myself?" "Because it was driven rather well." He blinked at her. "I was pretty worried, I can tell you," she said, offering him the bottle again, before having a sip herself. "When the car tore past me, I just followed." "And you weren't seen?" She shook her head. "I kept the headlights off." Oscar was impressed and said so. The derby didn't smile, however. In fact, she looked rather worried. "It was very difficult, actually," she said. "The ZR is an awful lot faster than the saloon, and I didn't know where I was going." "Well done, the derby. And where's Horace's car now? Outside? Did you see Sedovitz leave?" Her face went dark with a deeply scribed bitterness at the mention of that cat. She had seen him indeed, and it would take some time for her to accept his involvement with the council. She had trusted that animal. "Yes, I saw him leave," she said sourly. Oscar said nothing, knowing well the hurt of betrayal. "Where on earth are we?" he asked, approaching the window which now bathed the room in day. "The Thet," she said, "the seat of the ruling council, perched high in the ranges above the city." The view accosted Oscar with vertigo. Were it not for the derby's lunge, he would have gained a second bump to keep the first company. After assuring her he was all right, he said, "If you drove here, the derby, then you can drive us back to Horace's. Something is definitely brewing, and it seems we have at the most 2 days to find out what it might be." "Something's going to happen?" He nodded and headed for the door. "I'll explain on the way." But the derby was hesitant to follow. "There's one slight technical hitch." He stopped and turned. "Technical hitch?" "We may have to walk back." And she limped to remind him that she was already wounded. "Why?" he asked. "Where's the car?" I parked it." "Where?" She didn't answer, which left him with a horrid sinking feeling. "Where did you park Horace's pristine 1345 Muppet Fin ZR, the derby?" She nodded when the truth dawned. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Please don't tell me, not again." "I couldn't help it," she cried. "I've got an ankle all bandaged, and I had to try and keep up, and the edges were all steep, and I hadn't any headlights." "Not another cliff?" She nodded, biting her lip in punishment. "But only a bit of it, at least initially. Only a small one, and not off it exactly, more sort of, well, into it, really." He stared at her. "I thought it wasn't too bad at first, so I got out to have a look. But it was dark, and then the car started to roll backwards before, well, disappearing over the edge." Oscar sagged to the floor amidst a veritable swathe of blinks, and revelled in a good, healthy dose of despair. She had rescued him, certainly, something the derby pointed out repeatedly thereafter, but without transport back to Ruen, they'd lose valuable time. Time they could not begin to afford, which was particularly unfortunate because, according to Horace, the price of time was going to skyrocket shortly. Hotel de Ruen still stank like sweaty cheese, though its throat-stripping serrations had blunted somewhat. Nevertheless, while Oscar hurried across its foyer to the lift, he tried not to breathe. He pressed its button and wiped his paw. The doors pinged and clunked open, revealing Percival S. Minton. Delighted at Oscar's presence, Percival stood aside, deciding a return journey was well worth the detour. Oscar groaned. During a brief reprieve at Furballs, where phone calls were made, Horace had left for an extraordinary council meeting, and the derby had gone to brief her father. But having piggybacked the derby down the side of a mountain after being strapped to a chair arguing about poetry, Oscar was left with little tolerance for anything other than a sleep so unbelievably long it might be better described as a coma. Stepping into the lift, Oscar hoped it might crash through to the basement and put them both out of their misery. "Mr. Duvin!" What a delight to see you again." Oscar tried a smile, but nothing happened. "Are you enjoying your stay?" the little dog asked, nodding enthusiastically for him. "No." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Is there anything I can do?" Oscar looked at him in a manner suggesting there was indeed, but that would be followed by admission to intensive care. "Look, Percival," he said, "I am terribly tired and would just like to have a little sleep." "Ah," the dog began, implying doing so might be a little awkward. Doing so might be a little awkward, as I have just spent the morning removing the beds." "Removing them," Oscar repeated, in a peculiar blend of curiosity and fatigue. Percival nodded. "I pushed them out the window, you see, upon your floor and the one above.